Hi friends! Welcome to my in-depth tutorial on how to crochet the slip stitch join. I'm going to show you this method on the Daisy Festival top. To complete the granny squares themselves, you'll need to download the crochet pattern, which is available in 9 sizes. You can find the link to purchase the pattern in the description below. Start by laying the squares according to the diagram in the pattern. You'll start by joining the squares along this direction. Once you join all the squares along these lines, you'll start joining them in the opposite direction. When you're done, you will end up with a long piece of fabric, which you will then fold in half and join along the short edge. The joining method I will show you is called the slip stitch join, which creates a beautiful seam that can lay flat once it's blocked. One other trick I'd like to share with you before we start is that whenever I join granny squares together, I like to align them the same way, meaning with the unwoven in tails all facing the same direction. So in this case, this is where I joined to close the last row of the square. So I place it like this, and I place them all like this. For instance, this one is also oriented in the same way. Now we're ready to begin. I have already started my join. And I have joined together this section right here. Now I'm going to join this side together. Now, I've laid out the squares like so you can have a better visualization of how they will end up looking like. For the actual join, you'll pick up the squares from the layout and bring them closer to you so you have an easier time doing the join. Pick up these squares, wrong sides facing each other, and lay them like so. You do the same thing with the next ones. Always wrong sides facing each other like so. And you lay them next to the first ones. We are now going to work the seam along this edge. For this joining method, you will be working into the back loop of a stitch and the back loop of the corresponding stitch on the other square. Each double crochet from one square has its corresponding double crochet from the next square, and each of these two must be joined together, properly aligned like so. To start the join, you first will have to join a full square with a half square. You start by joining your yarn in the chain stitch immediately to the right of the first double crochet stitch, which is this right here. You insert your hook from front to back in this chain stitch and you join your yarn. You then insert your hook in the back loop of the first double crochet stitch from front to back, like so. You pick up the next square and you insert your hook in the same loop, also going from front to back. Like so. You now yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on the hook to complete the first slip stitch. You carry on like this all the way across. Here it is once again. You insert your hook in the back loop on the first square from front to back. You move on to the next square, find the next back loop and insert your hook from front to back. You now have 3 loops on the hook. You yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on the hook to complete your second slip stitch. Carry on like this all the way across. Don't forget to keep your tension loose so that the seam won't cause the granny squares to pucker. I have now almost reached the beginning chain 3, which I did in order to start the last round on this granny square. Here it is. I have to join this double crochet. Let's do that. And now, when it's time to join this beginning chain 3, which looks a little weird, don't worry about it. You just find a loop that looks like the back loop. For example, you can insert your hook here, in this loop right here. On the opposing granny square, you do the same thing as before. Yarn over and pull through. Let's do one more stitch and see how it looks. As you can see, we've passed this beginning chain 3 and it looks almost like a double crochet. Let's finish the row. Make sure you always have the corresponding stitches lined up. For instance, when I've reached the end of the row, I now have to work the last double crochet on this square and the last double crochet on this square. So since I have one double crochet on each square, I know that I have aligned them correctly. Let's work this last join. And now we have reached the corner where we have a chain 3. We will find the first chain stitch of this chain 3 and insert our hook in the back loop, the same way going from front to back. The same thing on the opposite square, from front to back on the first chain stitch, yarn over and pull through. And we have now seamed together the first 2 squares. As a general rule, whenever you have to join 2 corner chain 3 spaces together, you join the first chain stitch with the first chain stitch. And whenever you have a half square that doesn't have a chain 3 space at the corner here, you simply skip it. So this chain 3 corner right here isn't joined with anything. Now let's move on to the next couple of squares. To do that, you bring the next couple of squares close to you. On the first square, the one facing you, you insert your hook in the back loop of what is the third chain. So the chain immediately to the right of the first double crochet. You find the corresponding chain stitch on the opposing square and you insert from front to back. Now here is an example of what you must not do. The working yarn shouldn't be in front of your hook like this. So let's undo these couple of stitches right here. The working yarn should be behind your work. So once again, insert the hook in the respective loops on both squares. The yarn comes from behind, yarn over, and pull through all 3 loops on the hook. And you have now joined the first chain stitches together on the second set of squares. You go on like this all the way across. I have now joined the second set of squares together. And I have to do 2 more. I'll meet you back here. I'm now about to join my last stitches on this round, finishing with the chain stitches. I can now chain 1 to fasten off, cut my yarn. We have now joined this line right here. Don't worry that it's loosey-goosey and floppy and all over the place. Once we come back and join this side, it's going to be much more beautiful. Now we will join this side together with this side. And we will keep going in this fashion. Join this one, then join this one, and so on, until you reach the end of your layout. The last side you will join will be this short side right here. So I'll go ahead and do that and meet you back when it's time to start joining the other way around. I'm now going to join the squares in the opposite direction, and I'm going to start with this row of squares, and I'm gonna join them to these squares right here. I'm gonna start here, and I'm gonna move to the left, joining each stitch together. Now, to join this square to this square, what we normally do is we start in this chain stitch right here, right next to the first double crochet, and we do a slip stitch in the corresponding chain stitch from the opposite square. But since this is a square that's right at the beginning of the row, we also want a joining slip stitch between this square and this square to the right, so that you don't have a big gap here. So the way to do that is you join your yarn in the first chain stitch of the set of 3 chains. You join it here via a slip stitch and a chain 1 to secure, and then you go into the next chain stitch and the corresponding chain stitch on this square right here. And now these 2 squares are joined together. See? What's left to do is joining these 2 together. And you do this in the same way as before. You go in the first chain stitch and then each double crochet stitch at a time. We're now almost at the corner again. I'm going to join these 3 double crochets. You join the first chain stitch just like before. You completely skip the next chain stitch in the corner, which would be the center chain, and you go directly onto the next square into the 3rd chain stitch, which is immediately to the right of the first double crochet. And you go into the same corresponding chain stitch on the opposite square as well. Right here, and complete the slip stitch. After you have passed this corner, you now just join the rest of the segment together. I joined my last double crochet. Now I'm going to keep going and join the first chain stitch just like before. And now we have joined these 2 squares together. But since this is the last square in this particular row of squares, we are going to also go into the 2nd chain here in the corner and in the 2nd chain here in the corner on this square as well. And we're gonna slip stitch those 2 together so that it looks more compact. So back loop on the next chain here, the same corresponding loop on this diagonally positioned square. Complete the slip stitch, chain 1 to fasten off, cut the yarn. And now this side is complete, and you can see it's no longer such a big gap in between these 2 squares right here. And you're going to do this every time you have this situation where 2 full squares are intersecting each other on the diagonal. This happened here at the start and here at the end. And this will also happen here and here and here and so on. The next step is to join this row together with the next one, and you do the same thing when you start. You first join these 2 together right here, and then when you reach the end here, remember the half square doesn't have any chain space at the corner. We'll finish this row by simply joining the last double crochet on this square with the last double crochet on this square. And you continue on like this until all the rows are joined together. I have now reached the last 2 seams, which are this one and this one. I'm gonna join the yarn in this corner in the first chain stitch that is empty, and then go ahead and join this square to this square and this square to this square and then this one to this one. Now I'll join the last square, join yarn in the center chain stitch here, and start joining them together. All my squares are now joined together. What I want to do next is close these gaps between the 2 half squares at the top. And the way you do that is you pick out these tails. So the tail that is coming from the square to the left and the tail that is coming from the square to the right. This tail right here, you leave it aside. You tie one knot, which will help bring them together, like this. And then you tie a second knot to secure, while keeping the first one tight. Now these two corners are close to each other. You do the same for every single half square along the upper edge. This will create a neater upper edge, which you will then crochet over in the next step of the pattern. To really secure these corners in place and make sure they aren't going anywhere, you're going to weave in those ends in opposite directions. This one will be going in this direction and this one will be going in the opposite direction. And you do this for every spot where these corners meet all across the upper edge. Last step you need to do before you can move on to the next section of the pattern is to seam the short edges together. I'm gonna use this piece of cloth so you can see better. You fold your piece of fabric in half like this. It's going to fit nicely like two pieces of a puzzle, and you need to seam this edge together. You start out like you did before by joining these two corners together via one slip stitch, and then you move up and join each chain space and double crochet stitch one by one all the way across until you reach this last stitch, where on the half square you won't have any chain space here at the corner, and you just finish by joining the last double crochet on this square with the last double crochet on this half square. Once you have completed the join between these first two squares, you have to move on and join these two squares along this edge. However, before doing that, you also want to make a join between these two squares, again going through the corner chain stitch on each of them, and that will close the gap between them. Otherwise, you would have a small hole forming right at the place where they meet. You do the same thing in this spot and in this spot as well. I just finished seaming this edge. As you can see, there's no gap here. And now, the next squares to be joined together are these ones. But I'm first going to slip stitch these two together. Now that these two squares are joined together at the corner, I'm gonna seam along this edge. I'm now going to slip stitch these two squares together along the diagonal and then seam this edge, and I'll be done. Don't forget to also tie a double knot between these two last half squares. The joining is now complete and you're ready to move on to the next step in the pattern.